Story number 1. The Man Who Was Never Seen. The town of Briarwood had always been quiet, nestled at the edge of an ancient, sprawling forest. Its streets were empty most of the time, save for the occasional murmur of wind through the trees, the distant call of an owl, or the rustle of leaves in the autumn air. But something in Briarwood had changed that summer, something that no one could explain, and it started with the disappearance of a young boy named Jamie Holloway. It was late in the afternoon when Jamie's mother, a woman with a heavy heart and weary eyes, noticed that her son hadn't returned home. He had gone off to play near the edge of the woods, as he always did, but that day he didn't come back when he was supposed to. No one had heard anything, not a scream, not a cry. It was as if the boy had vanished into thin air, and so the search began. Days passed, and rumors began to spread, strange rumors, whispered by those who had ventured into the woods in search of the boy. Some said they'd seen a figure, tall and shadowy, standing at the edge of the trees. It was nothing but a silhouette at first, but those who dared look closer spoke of limbs, long and twisted, stretched beyond the limits of human understanding. No face, no eyes, just a tall figure with an unnatural presence. No one could explain it, but the description was always the same. It wasn't just the disappearance of Jamie that haunted the town. People began to speak of other strange events. The old oak tree by the woods had started to groan, as though something was pressing against it from within. Windows rattled in the homes that bordered the forest, and those who tried to sleep near the woods were plagued with nightmares. But the strangest occurrence of all was the discovery of a journal, an old, leather-bound book that had once belonged to a historian named Thomas Granger. Thomas had lived in Briarwood nearly 50 years ago, long before the townsfolk had forgotten his name. He had been obsessed with the history of the town and its surrounding woods, convinced there was something more beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful existence. His journal, filled with strange, cryptic entries, was found in the town's small library, buried in a forgotten box of old papers. The librarian, a young woman named Claire, had come across it by accident, but as she flipped through the pages, she felt something shift in the air. Thomas's writing was erratic, almost frantic, but as Claire read further, she began to piece together a story that was far more terrifying than she could have imagined. It started with the story of an ancient curse, a curse tied to the land itself, a curse that warned of a creature born of the earth, one who was never meant to be seen by human eyes. Thomas described it as a being of shadow, a thing that existed only on the edge of vision, in the corner of the mind, but never directly. It was a thing that had lived for centuries, bound to the forest, waiting for the right moment to return. The curse, according to Thomas's writing, was triggered when a person, usually a child, crossed a threshold into the woods that should have remained untouched. The creature would take them, vanish them without a trace, and no one would ever know the truth of what had happened. As Claire read on, she began to understand the connection between Jamie's disappearance and the strange figure in the woods. The creature, described only as the man who was never seen, had returned, and it was no longer content to remain hidden. It was watching, waiting, always just out of sight. The curse had claimed Jamie, just as it had claimed others before him. The man, the figure, was never seen directly, but he was there, always. Days turned to weeks, and the search for Jamie continued, but no one could find any trace of him. The forest seemed to close in on itself, as though it were protecting a secret far darker than any of them could imagine. The townspeople whispered about the cursed woods, about the creature that could never be seen, but no one dared to speak of it aloud. Those who ventured too close to the edge of the forest were never the same. Some returned with wild eyes, muttering incoherently about figures in the trees, about eyes that watched them from the darkness. Others never returned at all. Claire, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, ventured deeper into the woods one evening, clutching the journal in her hands. The wind howled through the trees as she walked, the shadows growing long and strange around her. Her heart pounded in her chest, and yet she could not turn back. She had to know the truth. Hours passed, and as the sun began to set, the forest seemed to come alive. The air grew thick, heavy with something she couldn't name. That's when she saw it. At the edge of her vision, just out of reach. Something tall, something with limbs too long, too twisted to belong to any man. The figure moved, a shadow among shadows, its presence more felt than seen. It reached out toward her, and for a brief moment she thought she saw its face. A face with no features, just a hollow emptiness where a face should have been. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. Claire ran from the woods, her heart racing, but she knew deep down that she had seen it, the man who was never seen. The curse was real. It had always been real. The creature had been watching, waiting for the right moment to claim another soul, and in the end, it would never be seen. Not truly, not by anyone who was meant to live. The townspeople of Briarwood never spoke of it again, and the story of Jamie Holloway faded into the past. But deep in the woods, where the trees whispered in the dark, the man who was never seen still waits, unseen and forever bound to the land. Story number 2. The Long Shadow. It was supposed to be a routine assignment. Lena Harris, a seasoned reporter for the regional paper, had seen her fair share of strange stories in her 10 years of work. But this one was different. A series of disappearances. 5 people in the last 6 months had left the small town of Briar Hollow in a state of quiet panic. The town itself was isolated, nestled deep in the woods, and most of its residents were the kind who preferred to keep to themselves. But the missing persons cases were unnerving even by the standards of rural disappearances. There were no signs of struggle, no clues left behind, and no pattern to follow. The town's police chief, a gruff man named Ray Thomas, had hit a dead end, and the local media had mostly ignored the story. That's when Lena got the call. She had been assigned to cover a weekend feature on the town, something simple. But once she arrived, she felt it. Briar Hollow had a weight about it. The air seemed thick, and the silence in the streets was too deep. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. It didn't take long for Lena to find the rumors. The locals spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously when she asked about the disappearances. A tall, faceless figure, some called it the Long Shadow, was said to be stalking the area. The description was always the same. A figure, unnaturally tall, its features absent, draped in shadows, moving through the trees at night. It was a thing of whispers, a myth the town had tried to bury beneath layers of time, but it was still there, clinging to the edge of the town like a bad memory. Lena didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural creatures. She was a reporter. She dealt in facts, in stories that had evidence. But the more she asked, the more she heard. A local farmer named Ed, his voice trembling, swore he saw the figure near the old mill one evening, standing just at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the twilight. It was as if it was waiting, he said, watching. You could feel its eyes on you, even though it didn't have any. Another local woman, Margaret, spoke of hearing whispers outside her window late at night. She thought it was the wind at first, but then the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were so close she could feel the breath on her skin. Lena didn't buy into it. Not yet, anyway. But there was something unsettling about the way the town spoke of it. A kind of silent understanding, as if they knew something they weren't sharing. Her investigation took her to the town library, where she found old, brittle newspapers stacked in a corner, gathering dust. There were articles about the disappearances, going back decades. But they weren't the only oddities she uncovered. There were mentions, scattered in articles and local letters, of something darker, something older than the town itself. It was buried deep, almost intentionally hidden, but the references were there. Every few decades a disappearance would occur, and every time, the story of the faceless figure, the long shadow, would resurface. One entry, a letter from a man named Elias Reed, caught her attention. It was dated back to the early 1900s and detailed a series of disappearances from that time. Elias spoke of a creature, a thing that had been haunting Briar Hollow for centuries, a figure that could never truly be seen, only felt, like a presence lurking just outside the edge of perception. He described it as something that walks where it shouldn't, where no man is meant to walk, and said that it had been there since the founding of the town. The more Lena read, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but the more they fell, the heavier the weight on her chest grew. This wasn't just some folklore. This wasn't just a series of bizarre coincidences. The long shadow was real. It had always been real. And Lena could feel it now, watching her as she dug deeper. The whispers began that night. At first, it was faint, a rustle, a low hum. But as she sat alone in her hotel room, the whispers grew clearer. They were soft at first, a voice too distant to make out. Then they grew louder, more distinct, until they seemed to come from all directions. She felt her heart race, the hairs on her neck standing on end. The whispers were words now, syllables strung together in a language she couldn't understand. But they were there, inside her head, filling the room. Lena jumped to her feet, the room suddenly stifling, and she rushed to the window. The street outside was empty, quiet, save for the wind stirring the trees. But then she saw it. A shadow, impossibly tall, stretched across the street, its edges indistinct, blending into the darkness. It was just standing there, watching her. Its presence was overwhelming, like it was stretching across time itself. Lena stepped back from the window, her breath quickening. She had seen it, the long shadow, and it had seen her. The next few days were a blur. She kept digging, determined to finish the story, but the deeper she went, the closer the creature seemed to get. The whispers became louder, more urgent. Her dreams were filled with the tall figure, walking toward her through the woods, its faceless form pressing against her mind, making her feel as if it was inside her thoughts. She tried to leave the town, but every time she went to pack, the whispers would return. She couldn't escape it. The people of Briar Hollow had long accepted the presence of the creature. They had learned to live with it, to push it to the back of their minds, as if by doing so, they could keep it from claiming them. But not Lena. She was a reporter. She couldn't ignore it. She couldn't stop now. The day she disappeared, Lena was last seen walking toward the woods, her face pale, her eyes wide with something she couldn't name. No one knows what happened to her after that. The people in the town said she had finally understood what it meant to become part of the story. The long shadow still walks Briar Hollow, as it has for centuries, and those who look too closely will always find themselves drawn toward it, caught in its endless, unseen embrace. And Lena? She became another whisper, another forgotten soul. Story number 3. The Forest of Forgotten Children. The town of Willow Creek had always been a place where stories didn't quite fade. They lingered like the thick mist that rolled in from the nearby woods. The kind of place where nothing really happened, but something always felt like it was waiting to. That's what Henry Turner had learned the summer his younger sister Sarah went missing. And it was a summer that would change everything. It started the day Sarah vanished. She had been playing near the edge of the woods, as she often did. She was only 6, and Henry, 12, had always been tasked with looking out for her. He remembered calling to her, telling her to come home, but when he went to find her, she was gone. There was no trace, no footprints leading away from the spot where she had last been seen. The police searched the woods, the nearby creeks, even the old mill on the far side of town, but they found nothing. They said she was lost, maybe wandered too deep. But Henry knew better. She hadn't wandered. In the days that followed, Henry found himself returning to the woods, over and over again, searching for his sister, unable to accept what everyone else had. The town moved on, as towns do, but Henry couldn't. Each time he ventured into the woods, he went a little further. He couldn't explain it, but something kept pulling him deeper. It was on the 5th day, as the sun began to sink behind the trees, that Henry stumbled upon something he hadn't seen before. A clearing, perfectly round, with grass that looked untouched, as if no one had ever stepped there. It was eerily silent, not even the usual rustle of animals or the chirp of crickets. He stepped into the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest, and looked around. There was no sign of Sarah. There was no sign of anyone. Henry returned the next day, then the next, and each time he came back something felt wrong. The air grew heavier, the shadows deeper, and the sense that he wasn't alone became undeniable. On the 4th day he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, tall and unnaturally thin. Its limbs stretched out, long and gaunt, like tree branches twisted by time. The figure had no face, just a blank, featureless expanse where eyes should have been. It stood perfectly still, its gaze fixed in Henry's direction, though its face was a void. He could feel it watching him, like it was waiting for him to make the next move. Fear paralyzed Henry, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. He wanted to run, to scream, but his legs wouldn't obey. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The next day, Henry came back. He couldn't stop himself. He had to know what it was, what it wanted. The figure didn't appear again, but the forest seemed darker, more oppressive, as though it knew he was there. Every creaking branch, every snap of a twig underfoot felt like a warning. The days stretched on. Each day, Henry came back, hoping to see his sister, but all he found was the haunting presence of that figure. As the hours passed, he began to unravel the story of the woods. Old stories, ones the town had long forgotten. The old-timers would tell tales of children disappearing from the town, going missing with no trace, their names erased from history. There were whispers of something in the woods, something that had been there for generations, something that fed on the lost, the forgotten. They called it the Watcher. The stories were vague, scattered across old letters and rumors, but Henry began to piece them together. The Watcher was not just a figure. It was a creature, ancient and timeless, tied to the forest, and it was always waiting, waiting for the next child to wander too far. The more Henry searched, the more he found traces of the creature. It was in the whispers of the wind, the way the trees seemed to shift when no one was looking. It was in the fleeting glimpses of a tall, faceless figure that he would see at the edge of his vision, always watching, always waiting. But it wasn't until he found an old photograph, buried deep in a box in the town's library, that he realized what he was dealing with. The picture was old, yellowed with age, showing a group of children standing in front of the very same woods Henry had wandered into. At the front of the group was a boy, his face pale and wide-eyed, looking directly at the camera. Behind him, in the shadows of the trees, was the same faceless figure Henry had seen. And that was when it hit him. The boy in the picture wasn't just a child who had wandered into the woods. He was another lost soul, another forgotten child who had been taken by the Watcher. And the more Henry searched, the more he saw it. The figure, the Watcher, the thing that had haunted the forest for as long as the town had existed. He saw it in the corners of windows, in reflections in puddles, and sometimes even in the glass of the town's clock tower. It was there, always watching, always waiting. And then, one evening, Henry went into the woods for what he knew would be the last time. He had to know if the Watcher would come for him, just as it had come for Sarah and all the children before them. He walked to the clearing, his heart pounding, and stood still. The wind died down, the trees fell silent, and the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, the figure appeared. It stood just at the edge of the clearing, its tall, gaunt form stretching into the darkness. It did not move, but its presence was enough to fill Henry with an overwhelming sense of dread. He felt the pull, the temptation to step closer, to reach out and be consumed by it. But this time, Henry didn't run. He stepped forward into the clearing, knowing what was waiting for him. The Watcher's gaze never wavered, its faceless form always just a shadow in the corner of his eye, waiting. And Henry understood then. The Watcher didn't just take children. It took their memories, their names, their very existence. They would be lost forever, forgotten by the world, swallowed by the darkness of the woods. As Henry stepped closer, the shadows reached out to meet him, and in that moment he knew there was no escaping the forest of forgotten children. Story number 4. The Echoes of a Lost Family. Elliot Stone had always dreamed of escape. The city was a cold, indifferent place where his ambition suffocated beneath the weight of deadlines and glass skyscrapers. So, when he received the letter about the inheritance, he felt a flicker of hope. A decaying mansion in a quiet, rural part of the country. A place to restore, to breathe, to finally find peace. Little did he know, this mansion would become a place where the past refused to stay buried. The mansion sat at the end of a long, winding road, shrouded in mist and surrounded by thick, dense woods. The air was heavier here, the scent of decay seeping from the walls of the old stone house. But it had potential. The kind of potential only someone like Elliot could see. Someone who could look past the peeling paint and broken windows to the bones of a structure that once held grandeur. His family, the Stones, had never spoken much of their past. His parents, both gone now, had left little in the way of stories or memories. There had always been a silence, a quiet unease when it came to discussing his family's lineage. They were never wealthy, never prominent, but they had a presence. Elliot had always wondered about that presence. It was a presence that lived in the back of his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch, a mystery that lingered at the edges of his life. As he walked through the mansion for the first time, he felt something stir within him. It was as if the house recognized him, as though it had been waiting for him to return. The creaking floors groaned under his feet as he explored, his flashlight revealing old portraits lining the walls. Each face was distorted, the expressions frozen in time but somehow wrong. Eyes that seemed to follow him, smiles that never reached their eyes. He couldn't help but stare at one portrait in particular. A man dressed in an old suit, his face contorted, as though something had distorted his features just before the artist had finished. But that was impossible, right? This was an old house, full of age and decay. The first night passed without incident, but the strange feeling didn't fade. The house felt alive. In the quiet hours of the morning, he heard footsteps above him, the creak of floorboards echoing from the second floor. He had assumed it was just the old house settling, but something in his gut told him otherwise. there was something here. Something that had always been here. The next day, he began to sift through the attic, where years of forgotten belongings had accumulated. Old furniture, dusty trunks, and brittle, yellowed papers littered the floor. As he sifted through the piles, he found a box. It was old, too old to belong to the family that had lived here most recently. Inside, he found a collection of photographs, their edges curling with age. He flipped through them, each one more unsettling than the last. Figures in the background, shadowy, indistinct shapes that seemed out of place. But one photo caught his attention. It was of a family gathered in front of the mansion, their faces obscured by something dark, something stretching across the image. He couldn't make it out at first, but the more he stared, the clearer it became. It was the outline of a tall figure, long and impossibly thin, its limbs reaching toward the family like a shadow that never quite fit into the world. A figure he recognized, though he could never quite place where from. That night, the dreams began. They were always the same. He would find himself walking through the woods behind the mansion, a path that led deeper into the trees than he ever thought possible. The trees were black, their branches reaching out like fingers. He would hear whispers, soft at first, then louder, more insistent, urging him forward. And then he would see it, standing at the edge of a clearing, its long limbs stretched impossibly high, its face a blank, featureless void. The figure would turn toward him, and though it had no eyes, he could feel its gaze upon him, pulling him closer, as if it were waiting for something. The next morning, Elliot tried to dismiss it as a product of his mind, too much time spent in the mansion, too much silence. But as the days went on, the house began to reveal more. Strange occurrences began to plague him. Whispers at the edge of his hearing. Shadows that moved when he wasn't looking. He found notes, scribbled in a language he didn't recognize, hidden in old books and under floorboards. The symbols were strange, yet oddly familiar, as if they had been designed to provoke a memory deep in his subconscious. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't understand them. The mansion, it seemed, had secrets. Dark ones. Ancient ones that had been buried for generations. And the more Elliot uncovered, the more the house seemed to shift and change. Rooms that were once familiar now felt strange, as if they had always been different, as if they had never existed in the way he remembered. Then he found the journal. It was hidden beneath the floorboards in the parlor, its leather cover cracked and worn. The journal belonged to his great-grandfather, a man Elliot had never heard much about. The entries were strange, filled with ramblings about the Tall One and the shadows that stretch across the bloodline. The handwriting was erratic, frantic, as though the man had written it in a hurry, and in the final pages the words became clearer. His great-grandfather had written about a creature that had always been tied to their family, a creature that fed on fear and darkness, a creature that had been with them since the beginning. It was Slenderman. Elliot had heard the name before, in whispers from the town, in tales that the locals dismissed as nonsense. But here, in his great-grandfather's journal, the creature was real. It had always been real, haunting his family, stretching across generations, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was tied to the mansion, to the land, to the bloodline. And now it had come for him. The more Elliot read, the more he understood. The mansion had been built to house the creature, to keep it bound within the walls. But over time, as his family had moved away, as the mansion had decayed, the creature had grown restless. It had been waiting for him to return, for him to take up the legacy his family had left behind. And now, the creature was closing in. As Elliot sat alone in the parlor, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, insistent, filled with urgency. He could hear the creak of the floorboards above him, the sound of something moving, something tall and thin, moving closer, just out of sight. The face in the photographs, the figure in his dreams, the whispers in the night. They were all part of the same thing, and it was waiting for him, just as it had always waited. Elliot turned the final page of the journal, and the last words he read were simple, chilling. It is in the blood. It always was. Story number 5. The Silent Watcher. Growing up in the small town of Cedar Hollow, Daniel Shaw had always been aware of the stories his parents told him when the nights were long and the fire crackled low. The ones whispered among the older folks in town, half-forgotten legends passed down from generation to generation. Most of the stories were like the others, tales of strange happenings, of things lurking in the dark. But there was one story that always made his skin crawl, one story that seemed to cling to the edges of his mind, even when he tried to forget it. The story of the Faceless Man. It was said that the Faceless Man walked among the tall trees that surrounded the town, his figure slender and elongated, impossible to fully see. He was a shape, a shadow, something that could only be glimpsed from the corner of the eye. No one knew who he was or where he came from, but the stories were the same. The Faceless Man never spoke, never made a sound. He simply watched, always watching. Daniel had heard these stories for as long as he could remember, but he had always brushed them aside. He was a rational boy, not one for superstitions or folklore. But even so, the tales lingered, like a dark cloud hovering just out of reach. It was late one summer night when the story became something much more than a tale. His best friend, Alex Turner, had gone missing. No one knew what had happened to him. One minute he was there, sitting on the porch, laughing, talking about the future, and the next, he was gone. His parents had searched the house, called the neighbors, but there were no answers. Daniel had known Alex his whole life. He had never disappeared before, and the thought of losing him without a trace, without any explanation, gnawed at him. The search for Alex took days, but it led nowhere. There were no clues, no signs, just an empty, quiet town, and the feeling that something was wrong. Something was waiting. It wasn't until Daniel wandered into the woods, hoping for some sense of direction, that he began to realize the connection to the stories. As he walked deeper into the trees, the air grew heavier. The sounds of the town faded, and the only thing he could hear was the whisper of the wind through the branches. The path he followed was familiar, one he had walked hundreds of times, yet today it felt different. Stranger. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their twisted limbs reaching toward him, blocking out the sky. That's when he saw it. A shape standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall, impossibly tall, its outline too thin to be a person. At first, Daniel thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the setting sun. But as he blinked and stared, the shape didn't move. It stood perfectly still, its form somehow wrong, as if it didn't belong in the world. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He had seen this shape before, in the stories, in the nightmares that had haunted him as a child. The Faceless Man. Daniel's heart raced as he turned and ran, not knowing what he was running from, only that something was chasing him. Something was waiting for him. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the woods, breathless and trembling, his mind reeling with the impossible image of the tall, faceless figure. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The image of the Faceless Man burned into his mind. He tried to tell himself it was just a figment of his imagination, a trick played on him by the dark woods. But deep down, he knew better. He knew what he had seen. The days that followed were a blur of fear and obsession. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were calling to him, that the faceless man was out there, waiting. He began to spend more time in the woods, walking along the same paths, searching for something, anything, that could explain what had happened to Alex. He found strange things in the woods. Scratches on the trees, deep gouges in the bark, as though something had torn at them with unnatural strength. He found footprints in the mud, too large to belong to any animal, too strange to belong to a person. And most unsettling of all, he began to find symbols carved into the trunks of the trees, symbols that seemed familiar, though he couldn't place them. The further he ventured into the woods, the more his mind began to unravel. He couldn't stop thinking about Alex, about the faceless man, about the strange drawings he found. Every night, the images of the faceless figure would return in his dreams, always watching, always waiting. The whispers in the wind grew louder, and Daniel couldn't tell where they were coming from anymore. Were they real, or were they just in his head? The line between reality and nightmare began to blur. One evening, Daniel decided he couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to face the thing that had been haunting him. He had to find Alex, and he had to confront the faceless man. Armed with nothing but his fear and the dark stories that had haunted him for years, he ventured deep into the heart of the woods, beyond the paths he knew, to the place where the trees grew so close together it felt like the earth itself was swallowing him whole. He didn't know how long he walked, but when he finally stopped, he was no longer in the woods he knew. The trees were different, older, gnarled and twisted like the fingers of some ancient creature. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay, and standing in front of him, just beyond the reach of the trees, was the figure. It was there, waiting for him, just like in his dreams. The faceless man stood tall and unmoving, his body stretching impossibly high, his limbs too thin, too long. There was no face, only a void where one should have been. Daniel could feel its presence like a weight on his chest, suffocating him. It was watching him, waiting for him to move, to make the first step. He could feel it in his bones, the pull of it, the sense that if he took one more step, it would be the last. And then, in that instant, he understood. The faceless man had always been there. It was part of the town, part of the woods, part of the blood that ran through his veins. It had been watching, waiting, following the Shaws for generations, waiting for one of them to cross the line, waiting for him. Daniel stepped forward, unable to stop himself, his feet moving of their own accord. The world around him blurred, the trees melting into shadows, and the faceless man reached out with long, twisted arms. The last thing Daniel saw before everything went black was the void where the figure's face should have been, stretching toward him, silent and unblinking. And in that silence, Daniel became one more whisper in the woods, one more story told in the dark. Story number 6. The House at the End of the Road. Mara Stevens had always dreamed of escape, a life away from the noise, the crowds, and the constant pressure of the city. When the opportunity to move to a small town on the outskirts of nowhere came, she didn't hesitate. The house was perfect, or so it seemed, tucked away at the end of a long, winding road, surrounded by trees and the quiet hum of nature. It felt like the fresh start she'd been yearning for. The locals, though, didn't share her enthusiasm. At first, Mara thought it was just small-town superstition, the kind of thing people talk about when they've run out of other conversation. They all spoke of the road leading to her new home in hushed tones, with uneasy glances. "You'll get used to it," they would say, "but don't go there at night." It was a sentiment repeated by nearly everyone she met. People who didn't know her, who had never seen her before, yet felt the need to warn her. But Mara wasn't one for old wives' tales. She smiled politely, shrugged it off, and continued with her plans. After all, it was just a road, just a house. How bad could it really be? At first, everything seemed fine. The house was old, yes, but beautiful in its own way. It had character, a kind of charm that Mara hadn't realized she had been longing for. She spent her days unpacking, settling into the quiet, and getting to know the small town. It was peaceful, with the kind of slow, steady rhythm that made her feel like she could finally breathe. But as the days turned to weeks, Mara began to notice something strange. The road, the one that led to her house. It seemed to take on a life of its own after dark. When she drove back from town in the evening, it felt different. Darker, somehow. The trees on either side of the road loomed closer, their branches stretching out like twisted hands, blocking out the moonlight. She'd quicken her pace, foot heavy on the accelerator, wanting to reach the safety of her home. That's when the dreams began. At first, it was just a fleeting image in the corners of her mind when she woke up. But soon the dreams became vivid, too real. Every night she would find herself walking along the same road, the one leading to her house. But she was never alone. There was always something behind her, something that lingered just out of sight. It was a figure, tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, stretching toward her as it moved from the shadows. She never saw its face. There was no face, only a blank void where one should have been. Its arms would stretch further each time, as if it were trying to reach her, to pull her into the dark. Mara tried to tell herself it was just stress, the result of moving to a new place, but the dreams didn't stop. In fact, they became worse. She started seeing the figure during the day when she was awake. At first, it was just a flicker at the edge of her vision, something tall and thin, vanishing whenever she turned to look. But then, the shadows began to move in her peripheral vision, stretching out like long, twisted arms, reaching for her. And sometimes, when she would look at herself in the mirror, she'd swear she saw it standing behind her. The same faceless figure. One night, after a particularly disturbing dream, Mara decided to do some digging. She went through the boxes in her attic, rummaging through old newspapers, letters, anything she could find that might give her a sense of what had happened in this town, what might explain the strange feeling she couldn't shake. That's when she found the old journal. It was buried beneath a pile of old books, its leather cover cracked and yellowed with age. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Merrick, one of the town's first settlers. As Mara read through it, she uncovered a dark history, one that the townsfolk had clearly tried to bury. Elias had written about a pact, an ancient agreement made to ensure the town's survival during a time of famine. The deal was struck with an entity, something from the woods, something beyond the understanding of mortal men. In exchange for their survival, the people of Cedar Hollow agreed to give something in return. The pact required a blood sacrifice, a soul to be taken every few decades to keep the town safe from disaster, from the unknown forces that threatened it. The journal didn't name the entity, but the details were chilling. The sacrifices were made to something that took the form of a tall, faceless figure, a creature that could move unseen in the shadows. Its limbs were long, its presence cold and suffocating. The town had been built to accommodate it, and the road leading to Mara's house, the one she had been warned about, was the path that led to the creature's domain. The more Mara read, the more she realized that the figure in her dreams wasn't a product of her imagination. It wasn't just a story, a myth whispered in the dark. It was real, and it had always been real. Slenderman, as the creature had come to be known, was the result of the pact. He had always been there, watching, waiting for the next soul to claim. And now it was waiting for her. Mara's obsession with the creature grew. She couldn't stop thinking about it, about the road, about the dark figure that seemed to follow her wherever she went. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on her, the shadows growing longer as the days wore on. She couldn't escape it. Every time she stepped onto the road, she felt it. Its presence, pulling at her, drawing her in. One evening, unable to resist the pull any longer, Mara drove to the end of the road, to the very spot where the darkness seemed to begin. She parked her car, heart pounding in her chest. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers. The road ahead was dark, impenetrable, and as she stepped out of the car, the air grew thick, as though the very atmosphere was pressing down on her. And then she saw it. A figure, impossibly tall, standing at the end of the road. Its limbs stretched out, long and unnatural, and its face, if it could be called a face, was nothing but a hollow void. The figure did not move, but Mara could feel its gaze on her, the weight of it pressing into her very soul. She wanted to run, to escape, but her legs refused to move. She was rooted to the spot, trapped in the presence of the creature she had been running from, the creature that had always been waiting. The last thing Mara heard before everything went black was a whisper in the wind, a voice that was not a voice, but a presence in the air. You belong to me now. And as the darkness consumed her, she understood the terrible cost of the pact, one that had bound her to the house at the end of the road. Story number 7. The Child's Play. Dr. Nathaniel Hayes had always been a man of reason. A psychologist by trade, he prided himself on being able to unravel the mysteries of the mind, to untangle the twisted threads of fear and trauma that clung to his patients. But when the series of child disappearances started in the small town of Ashford, even Nathaniel couldn't ignore the strange patterns that began to emerge. The children had vanished without a trace. No ransom notes, no witnesses, no signs of struggle. It was as though they had simply faded from existence, swallowed up by the darkness. In their place were their frightened friends and siblings, all of them haunted by the same story. They spoke of a tall, faceless figure, a creature with limbs that stretched unnaturally long, a being that moved silently through the woods, watching and waiting. At first, Nathaniel assumed it was just the product of fear, children's imaginations running wild. But as the disappearances mounted and he began treating the children who had witnessed the creature, he couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker was at play. The first child he treated was Emma, a 10-year-old girl with wide, fearful eyes. She spoke softly, her voice trembling as she described what she had seen. She was in the woods with her friends when the figure appeared. Tall, too tall, and impossibly thin. Its limbs stretched beyond what a human body should be capable of, long and angular, twisting like branches reaching out to grab her. But it was its face, or rather the lack of one, that terrified her most. It was just empty. A void. A space where a face should have been. "I saw it," Emma whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "It was standing behind the trees. It wasn't looking at me, but I could feel it. It knew I was there. And then it disappeared." She clutched the edge of her blanket, her small hands trembling. "It always watches." Nathaniel sat in silence, trying to process the details, trying to remain calm. He'd heard about the Slenderman myths, the stories whispered in hushed tones, but he had always dismissed them as folklore, something the children had conjured from their nightmares. But hearing Emma speak with such certainty, seeing the fear in her eyes, it wasn't just imagination. Something had happened to her. Over the next few weeks, Nathaniel treated more children, each with their own version of the creature. Some described it as being tall and thin, others said it had multiple arms, its body a twisted mass of limbs that moved like liquid. But the common detail in every story was the same. It waited. It watched from the shadows, unseen but always present, always there. And then, when the time was right, it took them. Mason, a 9-year-old boy, was one of the most vivid cases. He described a scene that seemed almost impossible. He had been playing in his backyard when he saw it, standing in the distance, just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't walking, but gliding, its arms reaching out as if to touch the sky. Mason swore it had no face, just an empty void. "It stared at me," Mason said, his voice shaking. "I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. And then it was gone, but I knew it was still there, somewhere, waiting." Nathaniel couldn't deny the growing unease that settled in his chest. These children were terrified, not just of what they had seen, but of the idea that it might come back. They spoke of the creature with such conviction, with such certainty, that it made Nathaniel question everything he thought he knew about the mind, about fear, about imagination. Could these children really be inventing such vivid, consistent stories? Or was there something more to it? The more Nathaniel investigated, the more the line between the real world and the children's terrifying stories began to blur. He found strange patterns, details that didn't make sense, things that didn't add up. He spoke to the parents, the teachers, the police, everyone who could offer insight into the disappearances. But no one had any answers. The cases were piling up with no leads, no explanations. It was as if the children were being taken by an invisible force, something beyond comprehension. One night, unable to sleep, Nathaniel drove to the edge of the town, to the woods where many of the disappearances had been reported. It was a quiet place, the kind of place that seemed peaceful during the day but eerie at night. The trees stood tall and foreboding, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground like dark fingers. As Nathaniel walked deeper into the woods, he felt a strange unease settle over him, as if he were being watched. He kept walking, further and further, until he reached the clearing. The wind had died down, and all he could hear was the crunch of the leaves beneath his feet. It felt as though the world had fallen silent, as if the very air was holding its breath. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, something out of the corner of his eye, a shape, tall and thin, standing just beyond the trees. Nathaniel's heart raced as he turned to face it. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the figure, the Slenderman. His limbs stretched impossibly long, twisted and angular, reaching out as if beckoning him closer. But there was no face, just a void, a darkness where one should have been. Nathaniel froze, unable to move, his mind racing with disbelief. Was this real? Or had his own mind finally unraveled after hearing so many stories, after so many accounts of terror? But deep down, in his gut, he knew this was no hallucination. The creature was real. It was real, and it was waiting. He turned and ran, stumbling through the trees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure didn't move, but he could feel it behind him, a presence that seemed to stretch across the very woods. Nathaniel didn't stop until he reached the safety of his car, his hand shaking as he fumbled for the keys. But when he drove back to his office the next day, he couldn't shake the feeling. The stories the children had told him weren't just stories anymore. They were truths. And the more he searched, the more he realized that Slenderman wasn't a figment of the imagination. He was something darker, something that had been around for centuries, watching, waiting, and taking those who dared to wander too close. Nathaniel's obsession with the case grew, consuming him. He began to see the figure in the shadows, in the reflection of windows, in the flicker of streetlights. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape it. The creature was always there, always watching. And as the line between reality and nightmare continued to blur, Nathaniel realized one terrifying truth. He wasn't just investigating the disappearances. He was becoming part of the story. Slenderman was coming for him too. Story number 8. The Hidden City. It started as just another hiking trip, a way to escape the noise of their everyday lives, to breathe in the fresh mountain air, and to reconnect with nature. Luke, Jenny, Mark, and Sarah had been planning the trip for months. The mountains had always been a place of peace for them, a place to clear their heads and escape the worries of the world. But as they made their way deeper into the dense forest, they stumbled upon something they hadn't expected, something they never should have found. It was Mark who first saw it, a shape in the distance, barely visible through the thick trees. "Hey, look at that," he called out, pointing toward what appeared to be a collection of old buildings. Jenny squinted against the sunlight filtering through the canopy. "Is that a town?" she asked. The others were already intrigued, drawn to the mystery of it. They approached cautiously, stepping over tangled roots and brushing past low-hanging branches. The town, when they finally reached it, was unlike anything they had ever seen. The buildings were old, crumbling, as though abandoned decades ago, but the air around them felt wrong. The silence was deafening, too quiet for a place that had once been inhabited. There were no birds, no sounds of animals, not even the wind rustling through the leaves. It felt as though time itself had stopped. They wandered through the empty streets, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The town seemed frozen in time. There were remnants of lives lived long ago, old wooden houses with cracked windows, rusted street lamps, a playground with a swing set that had long since stopped moving. Yet, despite the decay, there was something eerie about the place, something that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. "What happened here?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It was as if she was afraid to disturb the heavy silence that surrounded them. The more they explored, the more they realized something wasn't right. The town wasn't just abandoned. It had been abandoned under mysterious circumstances. There were no signs of a mass exodus, no indication that the residents had packed up and left. It was as though they had vanished overnight. Mark found the first clue, a tattered old newspaper, its pages yellowed and fragile. He bent down to pick it up, brushing dust from the surface. "This might tell us something," he said, but when he unfolded it, the headline sent a chill down his spine. "The disappearance of Cedar Hollow. No trace of the missing." The article was brief, mentioning that an entire town had gone missing, with no explanation or leads. The only detail that stood out was a mention of strange symbols found near the outskirts of the town, symbols that seemed to have no known origin. "Maybe we should head back," Jenny said, unease creeping into her voice. But Mark, ever the adventurer, shook his head. "No, we've come this far. Let's see if we can figure out what happened." They pressed on, exploring the abandoned buildings one by one. It was in the last house they checked, a small, run-down cabin on the edge of the town, that they found the door to the underground complex. The door was hidden behind a crumbling bookcase, the hinges rusted with age. Jenny was the one to pull it open, revealing a set of narrow wooden stairs that led down into darkness. The air that rose from the opening was stale and cold, sending a shiver down their spines. But the pull of curiosity was stronger than their fear, and one by one, they descended into the depths. The underground complex was a labyrinth of narrow halls and rooms, most of them empty, their walls covered in peeling paint and rot. But the deeper they went, the more they began to find strange markings on the walls, symbols drawn in dark ink or scratched into the stone with jagged nails. The markings seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, making the hairs on their necks stand on end. Then, in the very heart of the complex, they found what they had been searching for: a large, circular chamber, its floor covered in dust and debris. But it was the walls that caught their attention. There, etched into the stone, were more of the symbols, along with strange drawings and messages written in an unknown language. At the center of the room stood an altar, ancient, weathered, and stained with what appeared to be blood. "Jesus," Sarah whispered, stepping back from the altar. What the hell happened here? When they found the photographs. They were scattered across a nearby table, old and faded, but clear enough to make out the images. The first photo was of a group of people, men, women, and children, standing in front of a large building, their faces smiling and content. But in the background, lurking just beyond the shadows of the trees, was a tall, thin figure. It was impossible to see its face. There was no face, just a dark void. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, extending far beyond what any human body should be capable of. And yet, it was there, standing still, watching them. The others were more disturbing. Each one contained the same figure but with subtle differences. Sometimes it was in the background, other times it was closer, its arms reaching out, its shape growing more defined. The last photo was the most chilling. It was of the town itself, the same buildings they had seen earlier. But there, in the shadows between the buildings, was the figure again, taller than ever, its presence overwhelming the scene. The words on the walls began to make sense. Rituals, sacrifices, promises made in the dark. The symbols were part of an ancient pact, one that had been made to ensure the survival of the town. A pact with a creature they called the Slenderman. As they pieced together the truth, a sense of dread began to take hold of them. The creature was real. It had always been real. It had fed off the fear of the townspeople, and when the pact had been broken, when the town had failed to uphold their end of the bargain, the creature had taken them. All of them. The townspeople had disappeared, but their sacrifice had been made to keep the creature satisfied, to ensure it didn't take more lives. And now, the creature was watching them. As they turned to leave, the air in the underground complex grew heavier, the shadows seeming to shift and writhe. They heard a low, creaking sound, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Too quiet, too deliberate. It was as if the very walls were breathing, closing in around them. They weren't alone anymore. The slender man was here. The friends rushed back toward the stairs, panic rising in their chests. But when they reached the surface, the town was gone. The buildings were no longer standing. The streets were empty. There was no sign of the town they had just explored. The only thing that remained was the creature, waiting, watching, just beyond the trees. And the town, it seemed, had never truly been abandoned. It had only been hidden. Story number 9. The Man in the Tree. It started like any other disappearance, the kind that seemed tragic but inevitable in a small town where the forest bordered every backyard, where children wandered too far, and where the boundaries between safety and danger blurred like the mist that rolled in from the woods each morning. But when 12-year-old Jason Field went missing, it was different. This time, there was no sign of a struggle, no clues, no trail. He simply vanished, as though the earth had swallowed him whole. Jason's parents, desperate with grief, pleaded with the local police, but after weeks of searching, the case went cold. No one knew what happened, But those who lived in the town of Oak Hollow had an unsettling feeling that something darker was at work. Whispers began to circulate. Whispers about the old treehouse in the woods. The treehouse had been abandoned for decades. It stood deep within the forest, hidden among thick branches and overgrown vines, a relic of a childhood that no longer existed. The children who had once played there had long since grown up, their memories of the place fading into the past. But now, the treehouse was drawing attention again, and not in a nostalgic, innocent way. It was drawing the attention of the people who sought answers. It wasn't the first disappearance, and it wouldn't be the last. Every few years, a child went missing, and each time it was the same. The trail would lead to the woods, and the woods would swallow them up. Jason's disappearance was only the most recent. A pattern was emerging. Detective Eliza Crane had been the one to take the case after the local police gave up. She had been born and raised in Oak Hollow, and she knew the town's history. She knew the old stories. But she also knew that stories and real life didn't always mix. She didn't believe in ghosts, legends, or anything that couldn't be proven with facts. So, when her investigation led her to the treehouse, she thought it was just another odd coincidence. But when Eliza arrived at the clearing where the treehouse stood, she felt a chill run down her spine. The trees around the house were unnaturally tall, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The forest seemed alive in a way she couldn't explain. It was as though the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. The treehouse was half rotten, its wooden boards cracked and sagging with age. The ladder leading up to it was missing several rungs, but Eliza climbed up anyway, determined to uncover whatever secret the place held. As she reached the top, she found something that made her stomach turn. A small pile of personal belongings. There were toys, a broken watch, and a child's backpack, all covered in dirt and overgrown vines. But it wasn't the items that disturbed her the most. It was the markings on the walls inside the treehouse. Strange symbols, carved into the wood, symbols that looked like nothing she had ever seen before. They were twisted, angular, their meaning completely unclear. But Eliza could feel their weight, the oppressive force behind them. She was not alone. As she stood there, examining the symbols, a shadow passed over the floor of the treehouse. She froze, her heart racing. For a moment, she thought it was just the wind or the shifting branches. But when she turned, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure standing in the distance, half hidden in the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its limbs stretched unnaturally long, twisting in ways that didn't seem human. It stood perfectly still. Its face, if it could be called a face, was just a blank void, an emptiness where features should have been. Eliza's breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively backed away, stumbling down the ladder. She didn't dare take her eyes off the figure as it remained motionless, its dark presence like a weight pressing on her chest. She ran. But the more Eliza investigated, the more she began to uncover disturbing details. She learned that the treehouse had been there long before Jason's disappearance, long before any of the other children had gone missing. The town's elders, the ones who had lived in Oak Hollow their whole lives, spoke of a long-forgotten ritual, one that had once been practiced in the forest. The story was buried in old journals, in dusty town records, and in the whispered conversations of the few people who remembered. It was a story about a pact made long ago with a creature that came from the very heart of the forest. The creature, known only as the Slenderman, was bound to the land by an ancient, forgotten religion, a religion that demanded sacrifice. The children were never meant to wander too far into the woods, for they were always watched by the Slenderman. And when the time came, when the pact was broken or forgotten, the Slenderman would claim his victims, drawn to the treehouse as a place of power. Eliza was horrified by what she uncovered. The creature, with its faceless, towering form, was not just a product of local legend, it was real. The treehouse had been built as a marker, a place where the veil between the human world and the otherworldly one thinned. The forest, the trees, the very land itself were part of the creature's domain, and every child who disappeared had been drawn to that place, whether they knew it or not. The more Eliza uncovered, the more she began to suspect that the town itself was caught in a cycle, a curse that had been in place for centuries. The Slenderman fed on the fear and the sacrifices of the children, his power growing stronger with every life taken. And no one, not even the investigators, were safe from the creature's reach. Desperate to put an end to the cycle, Eliza rallied a group of local investigators to search the woods, to find the source of the creature's power and destroy it. They ventured deep into the forest, following the trail of disappearances. But the deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to close in on them. The trees seemed to move, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. And through the darkness, they could hear the sound of footsteps behind them. Too many steps, too quiet, but unmistakable. It wasn't until they reached the heart of the woods near the old treehouse that they saw it again. The Slenderman, standing tall among the trees, waiting. His arms stretched toward them, his shadow enveloping the group as they tried to turn and run. But it was too late. The woods had claimed them, just as it had claimed the others. The town of Oak Hollow would never be the same, and the treehouse, hidden deep within the forest, would remain a silent witness to the ancient pact. A pact that was bound by the very land itself. A pact that could never be broken. The Slender Man would wait, as he always had, until the next child wandered too far, and then the cycle would begin again. Story number 10. The Shadows of the Mind. Daniel Waller woke up every morning with the same heavy feeling, as if his life had been a dream he could barely remember. His name, his age, even his reflection in the mirror seemed unfamiliar to him, like a ghost haunting his own body. Amnesia, the doctors had called it. A condition so deep and persistent that even his family seemed like strangers to him, their faces blurred and out of focus. The worst part was the silence. The kind of silence that settled deep in his mind. A vacuum where thoughts should be. A place where memories should reside. He knew there were pieces of himself hidden somewhere, like a book with pages ripped out. But every attempt to piece them together felt like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. Yet, there were moments, fragments of memory, that slipped through the cracks, brief flashes that seemed to pulse with a dark urgency. These flashes were always the same. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing just outside the range of his vision. He could never see its face, only a vague outline of its shape. And yet, he knew it was always watching him. The figure appeared in his dreams, too, haunting him in the dark corners of his mind. Its presence was a weight, a shadow that pressed down on him, never allowing him to escape. It stood motionless, its limbs unnaturally long, stretching toward him in a way that shouldn't be possible. Each time he awoke, drenched in sweat, the feeling lingered. A terror he couldn't shake, a knowledge he couldn't access. As weeks passed, these flashes became more frequent, more vivid. He began to see glimpses of a past he didn't fully understand, of a time when he was not alone. There were other children in the memory. Children he somehow knew, their faces etched with fear, their eyes wide with the kind of terror he had only seen in the faces of animals in the wild. They were running, hiding, but from what, and why was he with them? Daniel started visiting old places, walking the streets he once knew, trying to jog his memory. One evening, after a particularly unsettling flash, he found himself standing in front of a house he didn't recognize. The house was old, worn down, its windows dark and vacant. But something about it felt familiar. He felt drawn to it, as if his body was remembering what his mind couldn't. He knocked on the door, and a woman answered. Her face was unfamiliar, but there was a strange recognition in her eyes. She introduced herself as Margaret, someone from his past, though Daniel didn't remember her. But she welcomed him inside, as though she had been waiting for him. "I've been meaning to talk to you," she said as they sat down in the dimly lit living room. "I'm not sure you're ready, but I think you have the right to know." Her words felt like a weight on his chest, like something had been left unsaid for too long. "Do you remember anything about the others?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The other children?" Daniel shook his head. "No, I don't even remember you." Margaret sighed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It's been so long, Daniel. You were part of something terrible. But it's not your fault, it never was." His heart began to race. He felt as though he was standing on the edge of something dark and dangerous. Margaret continued, "We were all targeted, every single one of us, by someone. You saw it too, didn't you? Tall, faceless, always watching us." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The Slenderman." The name hit him like a physical blow, a word that echoed through the empty chambers of his mind. He had heard it before, in hushed whispers, in places he couldn't quite remember. But now it was real, and it felt like the last piece of the puzzle snapping into place. The Slenderman. He remembered, or at least, he felt like he did. A towering figure with long, unnatural limbs, stretching, reaching toward him and the others. The memory was blurry, fragmented, but the terror, the sheer, mind-numbing terror, was as clear as day. He had been part of something bad, something that had happened long before his memory had been wiped clean. Margaret's eyes filled with sorrow. "He came for us. He took us, one by one. But you..." She paused, her voice shaking. "You were different. He didn't take you right away. He erased you. He made sure you couldn't remember." "Why?" Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "Because you were the key. You were the one who could stop him. Or you could have stopped him." Her face twisted in grief. "The creature has been toying with you, Daniel, erasing parts of your memory, keeping you from remembering what happened, keeping you from understanding that you're still connected to it, to him." A cold shiver ran down Daniel's spine as the truth began to form, like a shadow in the corners of his mind. The Slender Man wasn't just some creature from a forgotten nightmare. It was something older, more powerful, something that thrived on fear and the remnants of lost souls. And it had been playing with him, erasing his memories to keep him from remembering the horrors he had faced as a child. But why? Why now? Before Daniel could ask, Margaret stood up, walking to a small table by the window. She pulled out an old, tattered journal and handed it to him. "This is yours," she said quietly. "I kept it all these years, hoping you'd come back to yourself. There are things in here, things that can help you remember. But be careful, the Slender Man won't let you remember easily. He will do anything to keep you from seeing the truth." Daniel opened the journal, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. The writing was messy, frantic, like someone had written in a hurry, trying to get it all down before it was too late. There were sketches, drawings of the Slender Man, tall and faceless, standing among the children, his arms stretching out toward them. The pages were filled with warnings, instructions, and stories about the creature's power. It all made sense now. The Slender Man wasn't just a memory from his past. He was an ancient force, a creature bound by an old, forgotten religion, a being that fed on the souls of the innocent. And Daniel had been caught in his web, a child marked by fate, chosen to be a part of the creature's twisted games. As Daniel read on, the memories flooded back, rushing to the surface like a tidal wave. He remembered the fear, the screams, the darkness that had consumed them all. He remembered how they had tried to escape, how they had thought they could fight back, but none of them had made it. None except him. But why had the Slender Man spared him? Why had he erased his memories, keeping him in the dark? The answer came to him in a flash. The creature wasn't done with him yet. It had let him forget for a reason. It was waiting, watching, knowing that when the time was right, it would come for him again. And this time, there would be no escape. Daniel closed the journal, his hands shaking. The creature was still out there, lurking in the shadows of his mind, and it was ready to finish what it had started all those years ago. He could hear its whispers now, faint but growing louder, echoing through the empty chambers of his mind. "Come back to me, Daniel." And in the darkness, he knew he would never be free.